Nowadays, there are 1,000 reasons why people decide to go out and exercise. Some do it to keep fit, others because they love sport, and in my case, because I enjoy the company. I know it may sound strange, but I'll tell you. During the pandemic, I spent a lot of time alone, and that terrified me. Now, however, I am much more adapted to single life in New York, and I have made some friends. But the truth is that I have always liked the bustle of people. One of my favorite activities is going out for a run in the park, and while I'm doing it, I like to take a deep breath and feel the fresh air entering my lungs. I'm not bothered by the sound of the traffic or the atmosphere of the countryside. I just run and watch people going about their lives, and there I am, just another runner in the middle of it all. It's funny, but sometimes I feel like an invisible extra in a movie, and I like that. But one day, things took an unexpected turn. That afternoon, I was running as usual, when suddenly I noticed that someone was following me. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was just another girl out running, nothing out of the ordinary. However, as time went by, I started to feel that something was wrong. I don't know, it was a strange feeling. There was something in her gaze that made my hair stand on end, as if an alarm was going off in my head telling me that I should get away from her. So I decided to do just that. To my surprise, she didn't try to catch up with me, although her gaze remained fixed on me. I decided to run a little faster, glancing back every now and then, seeing with relief that little by little the girl who was watching me was gradually getting further and further away. At that moment, I laughed at myself. I started to think that maybe I was going crazy, exaggerating about someone who was simply following the same path as me. No more horror stories to sleep with, Amaya, I said to myself. However, for some reason, that feeling of danger did not go away. When I finally left that disturbing presence behind me, I felt calmer, even relieved, so I continued running, lost in my thoughts. But just as I turned to look, there she was again, crouching down, tying her shoes, but with a strange smile on her face and a look that seemed malicious and somewhat macabre. This was too much, and the whole situation was starting to get to me, so I picked up the pace and made my way toward the exit of the park. But suddenly everything went blurry. My legs started to hurt as if something was pricking my skin, and before I knew it, I was trapped in a nightmare from which I didn't know how to escape. Suddenly, both my legs went numb and I fell to the ground, motionless. Soon people began to surround me, concerned, but no matter how hard I tried to speak, I couldn't make a sound. It was as if my tongue had been separated from my brain, and that was really terrifying. But just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more confusing, the girl suddenly appeared and told everyone to move aside, that she was my girlfriend and she would take me with her, making up a story about how I sometimes had a strange fainting spell, but then I would come round. She was astonished. She couldn't believe what she was saying, and worst of all, I was paralyzed, completely unable to defend myself. Then she simply picked me up and threw me over her shoulders like a sack of potatoes, taking me out of the square. This was a large, rather corpulent woman, so it didn't surprise me that she could carry my small, skinny body so easily, while I could only babble nonsense, aware of everything that was happening but unable to move or express myself or say anything coherent. As she carried me on her back and took me out of the park, she laughed, as if she were enjoying some kind of macabre game. "Why are you laughing so much?" I thought. "Do you think this is funny?" But in the midst of her madness, I heard fragments of her conversation. She was saying things like, "You don't need a reason for your life to end. You're not special, and you won't be the first." Her mocking and disturbing tone got on my nerves. We were running through a crossroads full of cars passing from one side to the other, while she zigzagged as if it were a game. And at that moment, she began to say something that gave me chills. Before they die, everyone thinks their end is going to be meaningful. But that's not true. It's a lie. Death has no meaning, she continued, laughing. It just happens, and you can be a victim of someone who doesn't know you at all, like me. You mean nothing to me. After saying that, she suddenly threw me to the ground and left me there. It was then that I realized that a car was approaching at high speed. My heart stopped. Never in my life had I felt such panic and despair. I was motionless, feeling how my life was about to vanish in an absurd and stupid way, just as that psychopath had told me. For no reason, for no motive, and what's worse, without me being able to do anything to prevent it. In my mind, I saw flashes of my whole life, each moment passing like a review in fast motion. But just when I thought my death was imminent, incredibly the vehicle dodged the impact in time, hitting another car and causing a mini chaos on the road. While I lay there, watching it all in complete shock, like someone watching a movie in the cinema, only I was part of it. From the ground, I watched helplessly as other cars swerved around me and passed me by. I tried to move with all my might, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. It was then that I saw a third car skidding uncontrollably in my direction. Now I'm really fucked, I said to myself and squeezed my eyelids, which was the only thing I could move, waiting for the impact that would mark my end. But then, a miracle happened. A second car crashed into the one that was coming towards me, swerving just as the collision seemed imminent, and in an instant things calmed down. Police and ambulances quickly arrived at the scene and helped all the victims of the accident, including me. At the hospital, the doctors informed me that they had injected me with a powerful tranquilizer, something that is normally used in zoos. If they had given you a higher dose, I might not be here to tell the tale, they said. Meanwhile, the police managed to identify the girl, thanks to the cameras, but they didn't find her until her madness led her back to the park to repeat her actions. Finally, she was arrested for having killed other people in the same way, and when she was questioned, she confessed without a shred of remorse that she did it because it was fun. It's as if everything was a game to her. I don't know if that woman was crazy or just had a wicked and twisted mind, but I'm glad she's behind bars where I hope she never gets out. This happened when I was 15. My parents were at a resort for the weekend taking what they used to call couple time, so I was home alone. It was a Saturday afternoon and I was in my room playing Rocket League with a couple of friends. Just so you understand, they weren't physically with me. We were chatting on the headphones and everything was going well until, suddenly, I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I didn't think much of it at first because I have two cats who sometimes fight and make a fuss. I was just worried that they might break something, but I decided to keep playing and just turned down the volume a little to make sure they weren't doing anything weird. But after 2 minutes, I heard another thud, followed by what sounded like a growl. "Hey, I think there's something weird downstairs. I'm going to check it out. Wait a second. I'll be right back," I told them, and went out to see what was going on. I went downstairs thinking that my cats were having another one of their crazy fights, but when I got halfway down, I froze in place. I could hear men's voices whispering in the living room, and it immediately gave me goosebumps. I crouched down to get a better look, and there they were. 3 guys dressed in dark clothes and balaclavas. I covered my mouth with both hands to stop myself from screaming, and I began to slowly back towards my room, with the intention of calling the police. But of course, like in any horror movie, the last step creaked under my feet and suddenly everything went silent. I knew the men had heard the noise, so without thinking for a second, I ran back to my room and through my headphones I said to my friends, "Guys, I need you to call 911 now. There are 3 unknown guys in my house. I don't have time to explain. Just do it. Call the police now. I'm serious." Then I left the headphones on the bed, and my heart skipped a beat as I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I had to think fast, and I realized that if I locked myself in my room, they would know exactly where to find me, so I closed the door tightly. But I slipped away to my parents' room, leaving the door open so they wouldn't think of checking it. I know my plan was a bit crazy, but I had to act fast, and in my mind it was a perfect plan. After all, the hardest things to find are those that are hidden in obvious places. 5 seconds later, I heard heavy boots stomping on the wooden floor. The footsteps approached slowly and suddenly stopped in front of my room. I heard some forceful blows on the door, followed by a deep voice saying, "Open the door, kid, or I'll break it down." At that moment, my heart raced, and a mixture of panic and adrenaline coursed through me from head to toe. Panicking, I rushed to the window of my parents' room and opened it. It probably made a noise because I heard hurried footsteps and someone ran towards me, and what happened next almost ended in disaster. I looked over my shoulder just in time to see a dark figure approaching the door, and in a fraction of a second he lunged towards me. I knew immediately that the window was my only escape, so without thinking I jumped out, but the man grabbed me by one of my ankles and started to pull me back into the room. However, I started to scream and kick, desperately trying to get free, and thank God I managed to move enough to take off my shoe just in time, falling onto the small roof over the back porch. But I was far from safe because when he saw that it wasn't a big fall, the guy jumped behind me, and when I realized he was about to catch me, I simply threw myself off the roof, rolling in a way that I thought would inevitably break a bone. But luckily I landed in the back garden where the grass was long and thick, so I only sprained my ankle a little. As I tried to get out of there, one of the men ran down the stairs looking to catch me, but I managed to hobble to the gate of the backyard fence. However, just as I was about to open it, this guy grabbed me and threw me to the ground. I tried to scream desperately, but he covered my mouth with his huge hand. At that moment, the other two men joined in and they all started to drag me into the house. But just when I thought all was lost, I heard the police sirens rapidly approaching down the street. Suddenly, the guys looked at each other and seeing that they were lost, they let me go and ran towards the back door. I can't describe the relief I felt. Although my ankle was burning, I dragged myself as best I could towards the main entrance, opened it and shouted, "Help! They're in the backyard!" Immediately, 3 policemen ran towards the back of the house while one stayed with me, helping me get into one of the patrol cars. As it turned out, they managed to catch one of the guys, while the other 2 managed to jump the fence. While I was giving my statement, my friends who I was playing online with arrived on their bikes. "What happened, Dave? Are you okay?" they asked me, looking alarmed. "Yes, I'm fine. Thanks for calling the police," I replied. The criminal they caught was charged with robbery and attempted kidnapping. It turns out that they had all broken in through a basement window after several days of watching the house. All I can say is that I'm glad I escaped with a simple sprained ankle. The lesson I learned is this: always trust your instincts and never ignore any strange noises at home. What I'm about to tell you happened a couple of years ago, but let me give you a bit of context before I start. At that point, I had been married to my husband Malcolm for about 3 years, but the truth is that our marriage was in total chaos, and I was not at all happy. Diego had been beating me for months, and we were both trapped in a spiral of alcoholism and substance abuse, not to mention that we were living off what was left of our savings in his mother's old house, so we didn't have to pay rent, and therefore we didn't work. Malcolm and I spent our days drinking, sleeping, or simply doing whatever it took to forget our situation. And given the violence at home, I usually kept him out of the house most of the time. The house only had a front door and a side door, and as they had recently fixed the side door frame, that was the only one that really closed properly. The front door was a mess, so we had put in an anti-brake mechanism for security, but the feeling of being safe was quite illusory. That said, the story begins one Sunday morning around 11 a.m. Malcolm, and I had been up all night drinking and doing crazy things. So at that hour we were lying on the living room floor, surrounded by beer bottles, and with the TV blaring. Suddenly we heard a knock on the door. I jumped up because I thought it might be his mother looking for Diego, or even worse, the police, because I couldn't remember if we'd done anything really crazy the night before. However, the tapping quickly turned into attempts to open the door, and we were starting to lose our cool. "It must be his mom," I muttered. Then I sent her a message asking if it was her, but she replied that she was at work. At that moment, Malcolm went to the curtains to see who was knocking, but when he did, he immediately backed away. So I looked, but what I saw left me confused and a little scared. He was a tall guy with tanned skin and brown hair, a complete stranger to me. We live in a small town where everyone knows each other, So I went crazy wondering who this man was, pounding on our door as if he wanted to tear it down. Suddenly the guy stopped struggling with the door, but I was even more scared when I saw him start to walk across the porch. I immediately told Malcolm to make sure he didn't try to enter through the side door, as he had disappeared and I didn't see him anymore in the front. He gave the impression that he was playing hide and seek, so I started looking through all the windows of the house. In desperation, I went to the kitchen where I looked out the back window, and there I saw him, walking through our backyard and across the alley. I almost peed myself with fear. Diego's mother's house was right across the alley, but she wasn't home. She always left the garage open, and that made me nervous because our son was at her house with Diego's stepfather and his sister. I called Malcolm's stepfather right away and told him about the weird guy, and he replied that he hadn't seen anything suspicious and that everything was quiet, but the fact that the garage was left open was driving me crazy. About 30 minutes passed that seemed like an eternity, and we didn't hear anything more about the guy, but I couldn't relax. Why was that man trying to break into our house? I had my car parked in the driveway, so he must have assumed that someone was home, and combined with the fact that the TV was on full blast, he could surely hear us from outside. At that moment, paranoia took hold of me. I thought of 1,000 things. What would I do if the guy decided to come back? What if Malcolm went crazy and opened the door to him straight away? The atmosphere was heavy now, and every creak in the house made me jump. I spent the day walking around, looking out of every window, feeling time stand still as anxiety took hold of me. Even though Malcolm said it must have just been a confused drunk, the feeling of terror wouldn't go away. Even less so knowing the stories that circulate about sick people entering other people's homes. So there I was, in a place where I was supposed to feel safe, terrified of a stranger, and worried about what might happen next. I told Malcolm that we needed to go out for a walk to see if we could find the weird guy, and while we were at it, call the police just in case, but honestly I was terrified that he might be watching the house from somewhere. What if he came in while we were outside? To be on the safe side, we decided to use Malcolm's FaceTime so he could call me from the living room, and we could listen to see if anything weird happened while we were out. With a knot in our stomachs, we drove a couple of blocks and suddenly we saw him. The guy was walking around testing people's door handles just like he did at our house. It gave me chills. Diego followed him down a street, and I panicked when I realized he was trying out at least 3 different houses. It was completely crazy. I couldn't believe what was happening, and even less that on that Sunday I was drunk, with my husband, who legally shouldn't be with me, and driving around the neighborhood on the trail of a possible dangerous psychopath. I was so scared that I didn't dare call 911. Suddenly the guy ran out and went back towards our street, but he was still a couple of blocks from home. We followed him slowly so as not to lose sight of him, and that's when we saw him go into the house of an old man we knew, because we used to walk by there. We knew his son, who was usually at home, but that day his truck wasn't in the driveway, only the old man's red pickup. The stranger went straight into the house because the door was open, and at the sight of this my heart stopped. What if he did something to the poor man? Could I rob him, hurt him, or something even worse? With my nerves on edge, I told Malcolm that we had to go and knock on the door to get the old man's attention. So I parked a little way away and Diego ran towards the door, knocking frantically. And as he did so, I saw the stranger come out of the house with the old man, and they both stood outside on the porch talking to Malcolm for about 5 minutes. I was confused. I didn't know what was going on. Then I saw the old man making a call, and the weird guy was on his phone too, while I could only watch nervously. After about 10 minutes, the stranger walked away from the house, still talking on the phone, and as soon as he was a house away from where he was parked, Diego arrived and I asked him what was going on. He told me that the old man was very confused as to why this guy was in his house and that he had never seen him before. Diego explained to the old man why he had come and that he had seen this strange guy lurking around, so the old man decided to call the police, but the stranger had an excuse ready. He said he wasn't from the area and that he was doing a job somewhere, but that his truck had broken down, which was why he was trying to get into houses, because he was looking for a friend's house where the door would supposedly be open, but he didn't know which one it was. Obviously, that sounded too ridiculous and unbelievable. Not convinced, the old man asked him what company he worked for so he could call them and confirm his story. So the guy gave a random company name, and then Malcon and the old man started looking for numbers online. It was at that moment that the stranger decided it was time to leave, so he walked away from the house, supposedly calling his friend. Malcon and I decided to get out of the car and head back to the old man's house to make sure he was okay and ask if he needed any help. The man thanked us for warning him and said he would definitely call the police to make sure the stranger was caught. After that, we decided to go home. I never saw the old man again to ask him if everything was okay, and I didn't hear anything more about the stranger on social media. The last I heard, Malcon's mother saw someone matching the description we gave her walking along the road on the edge of the neighborhood. I was relieved that he hadn't been able to get into our house and that we had arrived in time, broke into the old man's house, because I have no idea what his true intentions were, but I'm sure they weren't good. I was scared for weeks after that incident, and although Malcon finally fixed our front door, I was always afraid that guy would come back one day. The experience left a mark on me, and I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if we hadn't been careful. Deep down, I knew I would never forget that strange encounter. I've always had a certain fear of those dark games, like the ones they tell you about that summon spirits or bring things that are better left in the shadows. You know the ones I mean, the game of the glass, the famous Bloody Mary, or worst of all, Ouija. The worst thing is that despite my fear, I ended up giving in and playing it. And now I'll tell you what happened with a knot in my stomach. I'll just tell you that if you're thinking of doing the same, you'd better think twice. Although the experience was intense, it was absolutely terrifying, the kind you don't easily forget. It was a Saturday afternoon, and my group of friends, Anna, Lassie, Sophie, and I were at Lassie's house. Her parents weren't there, so we had the whole place to ourselves. So Anna brought her cousin Celian and his friend Liam, so there were 6 of us. After a while of chatting and listening to music, Lassie had the brilliant idea of getting out a Ouija board that she found stored in one of her parents' dusty boxes. I can't lie, I was quite uncomfortable with the idea, but Anna and Lassie, always the most daring, started to insist, saying that nothing bad would happen. Sophie and I hesitated, but in the end they convinced us, and after a few minutes, we were all sitting in the living room with the lights off, only a few candles lit, giving the atmosphere a gloomy touch. The atmosphere was expectant and full of tension at that moment. In my heart of hearts, I knew it was wrong, but at the same time there was a small spark of curiosity that I couldn't ignore. At one point, Lassie said some opening words in Latin and we started the game. We began by asking trivial questions, and as expected, the board did not react. Celian and Liam started to make fun of it, saying it was a waste of time and that we'd be better off going to see a movie. But as a joke, I moved my fingers pretending to type answers and they got really excited. However, everything suddenly changed. When I tried to say goodbye to the supposed spirit and moved my hands towards the word goodbye, something started to happen. My hand started to move on its own and the tablet moved to the word no. Believe me, it was horrible. Suddenly it was moving so fast that I couldn't control it. The letters came together and formed words that weren't in my head and that I could hardly process. "You won't leave," the sentence said. For a moment I thought my friends were playing a joke on me, but when I looked at them I saw that they were completely terrified. I panicked at that moment. This was a joke. The game had us trapped, and we knew there was a clear rule. We couldn't leave without saying goodbye to the spirit. So, unfortunately, we had no choice but to continue. I was scared and annoyed at that moment, so I demanded that the spirit let us go. At first, nothing happened, but in a matter of seconds, the atmosphere around us changed. The house felt colder and colder. The candles began to flicker and the darkness felt like a blanket crushing us. My friends were petrified and I couldn't speak. I was about to have a heart attack. In an instant, one of the candles I had lit flew towards me with such force that I could barely dodge it, and when it fell to the floor, the explosion of light illuminated the space for a second. It was then that I saw something terrifying. A figure behind the flame, a kind of statue but clearly alive. It had huge eyes and an echo of red tears flowing down its face. I was paralyzed. A scream built up in my throat, but the shock was so great that I couldn't even get it out. And when the candle went out, everything went dark. Almost immediately, we began to hear footsteps. Something was moving right behind me. Suddenly, I felt icy breath on my neck and the pressure was unbearable. The atmosphere became oppressive, and Anna began to cry while Cillian tried to calm her, although his voice trembled with terror. We all turned our heads towards a tall, thin shadow that stood motionless behind us, just looking at us. It looked like a statue, but there was something utterly terrifying about its presence. That thing was there, motionless, as if it were watching us. We knew that it could attack us at any moment, and Lassie tried to turn on a flashlight, but even though it was turned on, it didn't emit any light. It was as if the darkness was swallowing all the light in the place. Suddenly, the shadow began to approach slowly. Then Cillian got up and shouted that we had to get out of there. But the door was locked and there was no way to open it. The windows were sealed too, so we were trapped in that horror. I couldn't believe this was happening. Although I had heard many stories about the Ouija board, I never thought they could be real. I thought it was just a scary game and nothing more, but now I knew it was real, and I regretted so much letting my friends talk me into this madness. Feeling the shadow's breath getting closer and closer and a strange force pushing us towards the floor, it was increasingly clear that nothing was under our control. The situation was too intense, and I knew we had to do something, and fast, before that shadow swallowed us whole. The pressure in the room was unbearable. It was as if something had started in our spine and was squeezing us from within. We looked at each other, terrified to the bone, and decided to go back to the board to ask that spirit what it wanted from us. With a trembling whisper, we asked the question, "What do you want from us?" Then the board moved slowly and formed a single word: soul. In that instant, we all looked at each other, and terror was reflected in our eyes. Soul. It wants our soul. We're dead, I thought. Just as we were coming to terms with that, the cold intensified in the room. I could see our breath condensing in the air, as if we were in a freezer. The shadow was almost upon us now, and I felt a chill run down my spine to the back of my neck. It was at that moment, when the creature passed by me, that I felt my whole life collapsing before my eyes. It was a feeling of such profound desolation that it disoriented me. My eyelids struggled to stay open, and the pain in my chest was overwhelming. When I finally managed to focus, I turned in horror to see what the shadow was doing, and there it was, holding Anna's face. I froze at the sight of it. That thing, the shadow, opened its mouth in a grotesque way, and without being able to help it, Anna opened hers too, as if something were controlling her. Then I saw hundreds of mosquitoes emerge from the mouth of the shadow and head straight for Anna's mouth. It was terrifying. The insects seemed to swallow her, entering through her mouth and nose. Anna was in shock. She was shaking and her eyes rolled back into her head. She fell to the floor and went into convulsions. It all happened too fast. In an instant, the shadow vanished and the room returned to normal. The temperature stabilized and the oppressive feeling that had been there a moment ago completely vanished. We immediately rushed towards Anna, dead with panic. My first impulse was to put something in her mouth so she wouldn't bite her tongue. And then we tried to shake her and call her, but she didn't respond. She was in a coma. Without thinking, we ran out to look for help. And although the room seemed to be calm, the electricity was still dead and our phones weren't working. We took refuge at Tanya's, Lassie's neighbor, and called an ambulance for Anna. While we waited, we tried to understand what had happened. What the hell was that? It didn't make sense, but we all knew it wasn't just a game. Anna was taken to hospital a few minutes later, but she never woke up. The doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with her, but she didn't come round until a few hours later when she suffered a massive heart attack. We were all in shock at the terrible news. but we couldn't tell the truth about what had really happened because no one would believe us. In the weeks that followed, we all began to experience nightmares and strange sensations. In my dreams, I felt someone was watching me. Day after day, we dreamed of Anna, trapped in a small cage, crying. Her skin looked decomposed and her bones were showing, as if hunger was consuming her. A couple of months later, Lassie decided to move out. Her family could no longer bear the strange events that were happening in their home. Before leaving, she confessed that she and Anna had played Ouija several times before our session, and from that day on, a dark spirit began to follow Anna, who had asked inappropriate questions in those sessions. The reason she joined us in the game was because she thought that if she played with more people, she could get rid of the shadow by passing it on to someone else. No one in the group knew how to excuse Lassie for what she had done, and eventually we stopped talking altogether. The truth is that we still dream about Anna, and our dreams are always the same. It is as if when we sleep, we are transported to another plane, condemned to witness the eternal torment of Anna's soul, while her body decomposes underground. It all started with a cup of coffee, a thick and bitter brew that the office kitchen dared to call energy booster. It was a Friday morning, and as I looked at the brown liquid in my cup, I wondered how many things I hated about this job. My boss, my colleagues, those endless emails and tasks that seemed to multiply like rabbits. But the real trigger, what really drove me crazy, was the donuts. Every week I was in charge of bringing in a box of those sugary things, as if that could improve the atmosphere, which was already a disaster. As if a simple bite of dough covered with colorful sprinkles could erase the sadness of watching our lives go by between cubicles, drowned by monotony. That Friday, however, everything changed. I woke up with a desperate clarity and a plan in mind which didn't come out of nowhere, but had been brewing for months. I had been researching and planning every detail, and now I knew exactly what I had to do. I just needed the perfect moment. The guy at the cafe, a guy called Luke, didn't suspect a thing. He was always too busy trying to make conversation about the weather or what he'd seen on TV. I wanted to shove his face in the coffee machine, but I ignored him and carried on with my routine. With the donuts in my hands, I felt their weight, heavier than usual thanks to what I had planned. Once in the parking lot, I prepared everything. I had a can of cyanide-based poison hidden in the glove compartment of my car, and with a steady hand, I spread the powder on each donut, making sure they were perfectly covered. It was like an artist working on his masterpiece. The cyanide was perfect, as its sweet taste blended imperceptibly into the icing on the donuts. When I finished, I threw the can out of the window, getting rid of any evidence, and set off. As I drove back to the office, I couldn't help but imagine the faces of my colleagues when they tasted those deadly sweets. The laughter and chatter would suddenly stop and chaos would break out. However, my plans went awry when I saw Luke standing by the trash cans. He was looking me right in the eye with his cigarette in his mouth, and I froze for a moment, but he turned away and I thought he hadn't noticed and I had managed to escape. How wrong I was. When I got to the office, I put the donuts on the table in the break room, and the vultures pounced on them. I saw how they rushed to the sweet sin, while I smiled at them kindly, but inside, I felt nothing but coldness. I have to go. There are other things to attend to, I said and went into my office. 20 minutes later, I received a text message from Mike, the supervisor. We have a problem. When I found him in the hallway, he was nervous and his huge body was trembling like a leaf. Luke saw you, he said. Where is he? I asked, my mind reeling. In the lobby. He's trying to warn everyone. My heart raced at the sound of that. Take him to the conference room, I'll take care of it, I said, and Mike nodded and left. I approached the conference room with a strange calm, rehearsing what I would say, and when Mike pushed Luke inside, I had it all figured out. Steve and I have a plan, Mike said, shooting me a look. Why are you telling him that? I thought. Luke was panicking. He was shouting something about calling the police, but I wasn't worried at all. I walked over to him, holding one of the donuts I had saved for this moment, and told Mike to blame it on him. With a scared look on his face, Luke watched me as I lunged towards him, shoving the donut into his mouth. He squirmed and started to choke. I even held his nose, forcing him to swallow. His eyes were wide with terror, and for a second I felt an adrenaline rush I hadn't experienced in a while, but suddenly, the door flew open and a policeman appeared, his gun drawn. "Hands up!" he shouted, and my heart sank into my stomach. Luke spat the donut on the carpet and began to stammer, "Thank you," over and over again, while the policeman handcuffed Mike and me without saying anything. They let us out of the room like we were criminals, and when I looked back, I saw my plan completely thwarted, but not entirely ruined, because 2 bodies lay on the floor and their faces frozen in agony gave me some satisfaction. Maybe I had achieved something, even if only in part. Luke was escorted with us, puffing out his chest as if he had saved the world, but he wouldn't last long with that kind of morale. A few days later, I watched the news from my cell. They were interviewing Luke, telling a story about how he had foiled an attempt at mass poisoning. I laughed as I leaned against the cold wall of my cell, feeling the weight of what I had orchestrated. But what people didn't know, and neither did he, was that poison wasn't my only weapon in this game. I had been testing something more insidious, a delayed neurotoxin. Luke inhaled it as soon as he opened his mouth to scream, carried away by the sweet powder of the donut I shoved down his throat. At first he wouldn't notice anything, but in weeks or months it would consume him. Hallucinations, paranoia. It would be a nightmare that would haunt him until he realized that something was wrong. Yes, he had lost this battle, but the war was not over yet. Since my dear wife passed away, my life has become quite boring. Work, taking care of my daughter, and facing constant bills. So when my daughter Dana asked me for ballet shoes, I knew I couldn't say no, as she was so excited about her first classes that I simply couldn't break her heart. But the money issue was complicated, so I started looking for some good deals on the internet. One night, after Dana went to sleep, I sat down at the computer and started browsing. After checking out a lot of options, I found a pair of shoes that seemed perfect for my daughter to practice ballet in. The weird thing was the price, only $1. I thought it must be a mistake, but I couldn't pass up this great opportunity. So I clicked, and the next day I received an email confirming the purchase. I was proud of myself for getting such a great deal. The package arrived the next day in the afternoon, and honestly, it was quite strange. The box looked beaten and very battered. It didn't have any store label or anything like that. It looked like someone had just stuffed the shoes in there at random. I opened the box carefully and wrapped in newspaper. I found the shoes. They were beautiful white shoes, new and shiny. Dana, upon seeing them, was so excited that she put them on immediately, and she looked radiant as she walked all over the house. But I can't deny that there was something about those shoes that made my skin crawl. It was as if they had a kind of gaze that was watching me everywhere I went. At first, everything continued as normal until one day, while Dana was at school, I was relaxing at home watching my favorite program. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise coming from her room. Something that sounded like a heavy thing was dragging itself along. I stood still, turning off the TV and paying attention. Then I began to hear slow, heavy footsteps, and my heart began to beat faster and faster. It was scaring me. As I tried to make sense of the sounds, I asked myself, who is this person? How did they manage to get into Dana's room? I approached the room carefully, and it sounded clearer and louder as the furniture moved, as if someone was redecorating, banging on walls and rolling furniture. At that moment, I regretted not having grabbed a knife or something to protect myself. Very scared and with some courage, I reached the end of the corridor and saw that the door to the room was ajar. So I approached cautiously and opened it slowly. But as I did so, suddenly the noises stopped. That only frightened me more. I went a little further, and then I felt a chill run through my body. The handle moved slightly as if someone was trying to open the door from the other side, and panic overcame me. That person wanted to leave, I don't know why, but I had to stop them. Suddenly, someone started to push hard on the door, and just when I thought it was going to fall back, a heart-rending scream pierced the air. It was a scream of pain and rage, and it came from behind my daughter's door. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I grabbed a piece of furniture nearby and tried to block the door, but something on the other side pushed me with such force that I fell to the floor, and when the door finally opened, I thought I was going to find a criminal or something terrifying, but no. The room was empty. Everything was where it should be, the furniture in its place, the bed perfectly made, and Dana's toys scattered on the floor as always. After that episode, I noticed that Dana began to change. It wasn't overnight, but little by little she became more nervous and distant. One night, as I was putting her to bed, she confessed to me that she was having nightmares. She felt that someone was watching her in her room, although she couldn't see that person. She tried to sound brave, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. I was surprised as I had no idea what was going on, but I decided that we needed a break. Something wasn't right, and we had to find out what was happening. I decided to take Dana to the beach for the weekend. I thought a change of scenery would do us both good, and although it was a bit chilly, I thought it would be a good escape. In a moment of fun, I asked her to pose for a photo, and she was so radiant that I couldn't help but smile when I saw her. However, when I reviewed the photo I had taken, I felt a pang of anxiety. Just behind Dana, there was something strange, some feet that seemed to be standing there as if someone were watching her. I looked around for someone, but I didn't see anyone, so I examined the image again. The feet were still there, but there was no shadow or figure to accompany us. Confusion and fear washed over me again. I looked around for Dana, but she was no longer by my side. I screamed her name in desperation, running all over the beach, and the few people there barely looked up. It was then that I heard screams coming from nearby. I looked in the direction of the sound and saw a teenager pointing out to sea, with his girlfriend by his side, visibly terrified. I followed her lead, and to my horror, there was Dana, struggling to stay afloat in the freezing water. My heart stopped. I ran towards her, and as I got closer, panic struck me as I saw her body almost lifeless under the seawater. I finally reached her and held her tight, trying to keep her head above water, and I shouted her name, but there was no response. Her face was pale, so I tried to pull her towards the shore, but I felt a force pulling her down. At first, I thought it was the current, but it wasn't normal. The force was too great. I looked down, and there, under the water, I saw something terrifying. A face that I recognized immediately because I had seen it at home. A scream of terror escaped my lips, and I approached Dana with all my strength, struggling to pull her away from that thing that was trying to drag her to the bottom of the sea. The thing that was attacking her began to struggle with me, but with all I had, I managed to get my daughter out of the water. But in the struggle to free her, I caused her little shoe to slip to the bottom. I started swimming as best I could, with a sharp pain appearing in my back as if something were pressing down on me with great force, and I let out a cry of pain, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I reached the shore with Dana in my arms. I laid her down on the sand and looked back, expecting to see something emerge from the water, but there was no one there. The teenagers who had called me came over, their faces showing their fear. One of them pointed at my back, and when I looked down, my fingers were covered in blood. My t-shirt was torn, and when I saw the claw marks, I felt a wave of terror. After leaving Dana with her aunt and uncle, making sure she was safe, I went home. The first thing I did when I entered the house was to run to Dana's room. The ballet shoes were right in the center, perfectly aligned, as if someone had left them there on purpose. But I knew deep down that they were to blame for everything. Ever since they arrived at home, I had had that strange feeling of uneasiness. It was the same one I had felt when I saw that creature in the water. Without thinking twice, I grabbed them and went to the trash can, throwing them hard. But when I returned home and went to look at Dana, there they were again, right where I had found them. I couldn't believe it. I thought about throwing them away again, destroying them or burning them, but I didn't dare to do anything. I just stood there, looking at them, feeling that renewed fear. Without wasting any time, I decided to put the sneakers up for sale online again, this time for less than $1. I hoped that someone else would fall into the trap, and after a few hours I received notification that they had been sold. I quickly packed them up and sent them off, making sure that the return address was blank. That was the last time I saw them, and since then nothing strange has happened at home. Dana made a full recovery and never again spoke of nightmares or feeling that someone was watching her. Everything returned to normal. However, I carried on my conscience the guilt of having passed that curse on to someone else, but I also knew that I had no alternative. Whatever had come with those shoes was no longer in my daughter's life, and for me, that was enough. It may sound strange, but I've always had this strange dream. I wanted to be the chocolate man. Yes, it sounds like something out of a children's movie, just like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And in part it is, but as I grew up, my desire to be like him grew too, although without the magic of having a factory with Oompa Loompas. So I settled for opening a small shop selling handmade chocolates in a shopping center. And to my surprise, I was doing great. Everyone said it was crazy, that a little chocolate shop wouldn't work, but I proved them wrong. Before long, everyone in the mall knew about my shop and no one could resist my weird sweets. At first, I made all the chocolates from scratch. I was always experimenting with extravagant flavors, but demand was so high that I soon had to order chocolates from other companies. It was a moment of pure happiness. I was living my childhood dream and things were going great. But as they say, all good things must come to an end. And I never imagined that my story would come to such a tragic end. One afternoon, like any other, I woke up thinking it would be a normal day, restocking merchandise, attending to my customers, and selling chocolates. Everything was going well until a man entered the shop, asking for chocolates with liqueur. "Do you have chocolate with liqueur? I need some," he said. At first I didn't recognize him, so I replied, "Hi, let me see what I have left." As I was checking, I felt him watching me, and even though he had his back to me, his gaze was so intense that it made me uncomfortable. It was strange, almost chilling. Finally, I showed him the chocolates, and he smiled from ear to ear. "Oh, great, I'll take them all," he exclaimed. Then he took out his money and gave me the cash. "Thank you, you're very generous. Are they for your girlfriend?" I asked him. He nodded excitedly. "Yes, she loves them. She could eat chocolates all day long." I told him I hoped he enjoyed them as he walked off with his loot of sweets. I must admit that I felt a bit bad for having judged him at first. Yes, he looked a bit weird and his way of speaking was peculiar, but he seemed to have good intentions. However, from that day on, the man began to appear frequently. It was as if every week he had a special request. He always ordered 15 or 20 chocolates of the same flavor, which varied between mint, hazelnut, strawberry, or caramel. He had become one of my most regular customers. However, one day during his visit, I told him that I was short on production. "I want 18 filled chocolate bars," he demanded. "I'm sorry, mate, but this time I've only got 7 of those. I can also offer you mint or hazelnut," I replied. I immediately noticed how his expression changed and his gaze became dangerous. Instead of accepting my suggestion, his fury intensified. "I don't want those others. My girlfriend will be angry if I don't bring her what she wants," he shouted. And the way he said, "I need those chocolates," made me realize that his behavior was crossing a line. "I'm sorry, I really can't help you with that." I tried to stay calm, but he went crazy, throwing all the chocolates off the shelf and looking at me menacingly. Instead of being scared, I got angry. "What do you think you're doing? Get out of my shop now," I yelled at him. "I need those chocolates. Do you want me to fight with my girlfriend? She's mine, and you don't know what it took for me to find her," he replied, furious. "I don't know what your problem is, but I'm going to call the police in a second if you don't get out of here," I warned. But instead of leaving, he continued to shout about lies and conspiracies, accusing me of stealing his chocolates. The tension in the air was palpable, and his madness felt almost threatening. I was in the middle of the fight when, out of nowhere, The guy lunged at me and started choking me with one hand. I tried to defend myself, but he looked like a giant bear, much stronger than I had imagined. With his other hand, he opened a box next to him and started taking out chocolates. "Liar, this is what you wanted, isn't it?" he said, with a smile that made my blood run cold. "Those are for an order, that's why I'm not offering them," I shouted at him, in an attempt to make him see reason. When he released my neck for a second, I breathed as if I had just come out of a deep farm. But the nightmare wasn't over. He was still on top of me, crushing me with his huge body while I tried to process what was happening. In the blink of an eye, my peace of mind vanished. This guy wouldn't let go of me, and with one hand he was holding a bar of chocolate while opening the wrapper with the other. "What the hell are you doing? Get off me!" I shouted, but he didn't answer. Instead, his madness intensified. He started to put the chocolate in his mouth in a grotesque way, like soap in a shower, and his gaze was completely lost. I thought I was going to go mad with fear. There he was, with his body and face covered in chocolate, looking at me with a perverse expression. I didn't know what he was going to do to me, but I had a bad feeling. Feeling completely paralyzed by panic, I saw how he approached slowly, opening his mouth and preparing to drop the chewed chocolate directly into mine. I tried to close my mouth, but his hands were clenched so tightly on my jaw that I thought it might break. Gagging, I tried to vomit, and the mixture of chocolate and saliva was already sliding down my throat in a horrible instant. It was clear that the man had lost his mind. It was as if he was enjoying what he was doing to me, pure madness. But suddenly, a couple entered the shop looking for chocolates, and upon seeing the scene, they pounced on him, pushing him aside. At that moment, he offered no resistance. He just stood there, almost in shock, swaying in the corner. I don't remember much after that, just flashes. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital, and a nurse was telling me I was very lucky. A doctor, who looked very serious, told me that I had almost choked on my own vomit. If the ambulance hadn't arrived in time, the story would have ended much more tragically. Shortly afterwards, a policeman came to ask me about everything that had happened. And to my surprise, the man I thought was just a bit weird was nothing more than a kidnapper. He had held a girl captive in his house, and what he did was feed her only chocolate. And according to him, that girl was his girlfriend. She wasn't even a fan of chocolate, but that was all the madman would give her to eat. We won't say anything about it, just that my heart breaks just thinking about the horrible things that madman could have done to the poor girl. After all this drama, I decided to close the shop for a while. People were gossiping around the mall, so I needed to give myself a break. But months later, I reopened. I learned my lesson and secured the shop with extra staff. I didn't really need to do it for business, but because I didn't want to feel alone in that place again. I still had nightmares about the guy, and every time a strange customer came in, a shiver would run down my spine, remembering his grotesque image sitting on top of me, spitting chocolate.